Thanksgiving dinner at my family's place has always felt like a corporate awards show. Everyone dressed up, everyone bragging about something, and nobody actually enjoying it. My cousin Darren was already half a bottle in when I walked through the door. He barely glanced up before going, "Whoa, look who made it." The mystery vet returns. I smiled and gave a nod. No hugs, just nods. That's the dynamic. Mom was in the kitchen pretending not to see me. Typical. I slipped off my coat and hung it by the door. No one asked how I was. No one asked what I was doing these days. I took my usual spot at the end of the table, next to the half-deflated plant that's been dying since 2018. Across from me was Aunt Jean, who sells real estate in 3 counties and reminds everyone of it twice per meal. Darren tapped his wine glass. "Hey, remember when Nora said she was going into military intelligence? Thought she'd come back James Bond or something." End of quote. Laughter around the table. "She came back with a limp and no LinkedIn," someone added. I chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because silence would have made it awkward for them. Then Mom walked in with the stuffing tray like she was presenting an Oscar. "Dinner is served," she said, then looked at me. "You still on a government pension, or whatever they call it?" That got everyone's attention. I cleared my throat. "Technically, no." Aunt Jean leaned in. "So, what are you doing now, dear? I mean, besides looking so minimal." Translation: "You dress cheap. Must be broke." "I consult," I said. "Oh, like therapy?" Darren grinned. "Number cybersecurity." That got a pause. Not a long one. Just enough for them to pretend they were trying to understand what that meant before going back to their cranberry sauce. My Uncle Rick jumped in. "Bradley just made partner at the firm. You remember Bradley, right? He interned for Senator Carruthers in college." Bradley gave a small wave, Rolex glinting under the chandelier. "Good for him." The applause lasted longer than it took me to dodge an IED in Syria. "Nora," Mom said with a smile that could slice granite, "you remember Bradley used to look up to you? Now look how far he's come." "Yep. A whole law degree and a condo in Georgetown. I must have missed the parade." Darren wasn't done. "So Nora, be honest, how's it feel being the only one here without a career, a spouse, or a house?" Laughter again. I reached for the mashed potatoes. Aunt Jean, never one to let a passive-aggressive moment go to waste, added, "At least you're here. Last year you were off. Somewhere in Kansas?" "Virginia," I said. "Arlington." "Oh right, military town. Must be hard adjusting back to normal life." "Normal." "Sure. You know that. Takes time. Mine." Bradley sipped his wine and gave me that polite look lawyers give when they're about to tell you your case is dead in the water. "You ever think about going back to school?" I smiled. "Actually, I did finish grad school." "Online?" he asked, eyebrow up. "Mida. Cyber ops." That shut him up for a second. Dad, who'd been mostly quiet, finally chimed in. "So, you're not in the army anymore?" "No, sir." "So what do you do all day?" "I work." "Doing what?" "Security. Digital infrastructure. Foreign threat modeling." Blank stares all around. Aunt Jean rescued the moment by asking who wanted more roles. Then came the line. The one that officially ripped the air out of the room. "Still living off lie checks?" Mom asked casually, like she was asking if I wanted light or dark meat. A couple of cousins chuckled. I didn't. I looked up and met her eyes. "You think I'm living off a check?" "Well," she shrugged. "You're not exactly driving a Tesla." "Eister." "Nope," I said. "Just a Chevy, and a few contracts with federal agencies." She blinked. "You're doing work for the government?" "Sometimes." Darren leaned back. "So, wait, you're like a spy or something?" "No," I said. "Just someone who doesn't need to post everything on LinkedIn." The turkey was dry, the tension wasn't. I sipped water and stared at the flickering candle in the center of the table. That's when I noticed Dad looking at me differently. Not confused, not angry, just still. His eyes dropped to my jacket, folded neatly over the back of the chair. Something must have caught the light. His expression changed. Dad pushed his chair back slightly. Not all the way, just enough to lean forward without looking like he meant to. His eyes were locked on the corner of my jacket, and I already knew what he saw. The edge of the ribbon. The metal was still tucked in the inside pocket, but the way the lining had shifted, the metal must have caught the light. I kept eating like I didn't notice. Because if you flinch, you lose. The stuffing was bland. The air wasn't. The possums. Mom was chatting across the table with my aunt about someone's daughter getting into Duke, pretending I didn't exist, which was a better deal than usual. A wave of heat spread across my chest, not from the food, but from the memory that suddenly took hold just like that. I was somewhere else. The first time I smelled blood mixed with sand, it was Syria, 2017. Middle of the night, 48 hours with no sleep, and we were operating on scraps of intel from a drone that lost signal half the time. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was supposed to be in command tent running comms. But when Sergeant Lopez called for help, his entire unit pinned down outside Deir ez-Zor, I grabbed gear and ran straight into it. No hero's speech, no slow-motion montage, just panic, heat, adrenaline, and too many people screaming over the radio. We rolled in under blacked-out vehicles, 2 Humvees, and a local interpreter who had more guts than anyone else on the team. The air smelled like engine oil and cordite. The first body I saw was one of ours, slumped behind a broken brick wall with a photo of his kid taped to his helmet. His boots were still smoking. Lopez was still alive, barely. 2 men had already bled out. The rest were surrounded and low on ammo. I don't remember exactly how I got us out of there, just fragments. A map drawn in dirt, calling for air support while bullets hit the gravel next to my elbow, dragging a man with a shattered femur while telling him we were almost home even though I had no clue if we'd make it out alive. The Apache came in hot and loud, and when the smoke cleared, 17 of us were breathing, including me. But breathing doesn't mean you're okay. I got a commendation that year, a medal, a letter from someone high up that I never framed. What I didn't get was sleep, peace, or the ability to stand the sound of fireworks for 3 straight 4th of Julys. They offered me counseling. I took it for a while, until one shrink asked if I ever considered the moral weight of civilian casualties. I walked out mid-session and never went back. After I got back stateside, I lived in a month-to-month sublease near Fort Belvoir, working odd jobs under contractor names until my paperwork cleared. My hands shook for 6 months. I didn't trust grocery stores. I sat with my back to walls and scanned every room like I was still on duty. My old platoon had scattered. One of them OD'd. One started a nonprofit. One drank himself into a DUI in North Carolina. I wrote checks to 2 of them just to keep the lights on. I never told my family. Not because they wouldn't help, but because I didn't want help from people who didn't understand what we'd survived just to be here at all. The first time I saw someone roll their eyes when I said I was a veteran, I knew I needed out. Not from society, just from needing their approval. That's when I started Cypher Vanguard. Just me and a laptop and a friend I met on base who'd hacked Russian comm systems in his spare time. We got a federal research grant in our 2nd year. Not huge money. Just enough to prove we were real. But real wasn't something I could bring home. At least not to this table. Not to the room where people still thought my highest achievement was not dying. Dad hadn't stopped looking. I glanced up. "You all right?" I asked him. He nodded slowly. "That medal. I think I saw the edge of a ribbon." "Maybe," I said. His voice dropped. "It's not a bronze star. That's a different color. You've still got a good eye. Is it what I think it is?" I didn't bring it to show off. I didn't ask that. He looked down at his plate, then back at me. "You saved people?" "Some," I said. "Not all." "Still," he said. "Some is more than most." The cranberry sauce had melted into the turkey, and nobody else noticed the exchange. That was the funny part. Everyone still thought I was invisible. Turns out that's a useful trick when you've lived long enough to survive being truly seen. I let my fork rest on the edge of the plate, mostly to stop my hand from tapping. Dad was still watching me, not with pride, but with that specific confusion parents get when the child they underestimated turns out not to be broken, just busy building things they never bothered to ask about. I reached for the gravy boat. The smell of sage and burnt onions hit me in a way that felt like whiplash. It smelled just like the night before I left for basic. I'd been sitting at this same table, except that time it was only the 3 of us. No cousins, no aunts, just Mom, Dad, and me, arguing over roast chicken and a copy of my enlistment papers folded under a napkin. "You got into UCLA," Mom had said, like she was reminding me I'd forgotten. "Full scholarship, pre-law, people would kill for that." I'm not people, I told her. You could be something respectable. Stable. I don't want stable, I said. I want to serve. Dad had stayed quiet most of that night, but when Mom left the room to get dessert, he leaned in. If this is about rebellion, he said, you're choosing the wrong enemy. That one stung. Because it wasn't rebellion. It was purpose. After 9/11s, I didn't want to sit in a lecture hall while the world fell apart. I wanted to be useful. I wanted to do something that didn't involve waiting 10 years to matter. And yeah, I was young and full of conviction and probably stupid, but at least I was willing to bleed for something other than a resume. Mom returned with a slice of apple pie and a cold stare. She dropped the plate in front of me. You want to be a soldier, she said. Then go be one. But don't come crying back here when it all blows up in your face. I left the next morning with a duffel bag and a silent ride to the recruiting station. Dad didn't say goodbye. Mom did barely. At boot camp, I learned to wake up before dawn, to shoot straight, to shut up and move when it wasn't my turn to speak. But more than that, I learned I could go without my family's approval and still wake up breathing. Funny how quiet gets comfortable when you've trained in it long enough. Years passed. Deployments came and went. Iraq, Afghanistan, then Syria. I sent cards on holidays, sometimes emails, no replies. Once, Mom forwarded me a New York Times op-ed about the failure of the Iraq War, without a single word in the message. I took it as her way of saying she still thought I was wasting my life. Meanwhile, I moved up the ranks, got into Intel, took night courses, learned code, passed the defense language proficiency test in Arabic and Farsi, relearned how to sleep with one eye open. When I came home between deployments, I never told them. I'd stay in cheap motels near the base, get my teeth cleaned, fix my gear, and fly out again without ever walking into this house. There was nothing here for me except the memory of that folded napkin and Mom's voice saying I'd regret it. But I didn't regret the Army. I regretted trying to convince them. They'd already decided who I was supposed to be. Nora Ellison, daughter of Margaret the journalist and Daniel the public policy professor, law school, Capitol Hill, cardigans and Columbia degrees. Not boots and dust and classified reports at 3 a.m. The thing is, I didn't become who I am to spite them. I became who I am because someone had to fill in the blanks while they were too busy telling stories about other people's courage. Mom had reported from Bosnia in the 92nd. She told war stories like they were badges of honor, but only if you wrote about them, never if you lived them. There's a difference between witnessing a firefight and calling one in. She never understood that. Or maybe she did, and that's what scared her most. I thought about all that while stirring cold gravy at this Thanksgiving table. Across from me, my cousin Bradley was talking about Supreme Court briefs like anyone gave a damn. Next to him, Aunt Jean was bragging about her son getting into Wharton. Again. No one knew I'd been on a JSOC briefing 2 weeks ago reviewing cyber threat maps from a Chinese botnet cluster. No one cared that I helped shut down an internal leak from a private defense contractor last month that saved the DoD from a $20 million breach. And it didn't matter. Because if there's one thing the Army taught me, it's how to stay focused when the noise around you means nothing. Mom finally looked at me again. Her mouth moved like she had something to say, but she didn't. She turned back to her wine. I kept eating. I shifted in my seat, still holding the fork like I might actually keep eating. My plate was mostly untouched. The stuffing was gluey and the turkey had a weird metallic aftertaste, like someone had cooked it out of spite. Across the table, nobody was paying attention to me anymore. The moment of awkwardness had passed, replaced with champagne chatter and the clink of serving spoons. I tuned them out and let my eyes settle on the window behind Aunt Jean's head. Cold November light, gray and washed out, same color as the morning I walked into that first VA appointment in Arlington. The nurse had a voice like a dial tone and asked me to rate my depression on a scale of 1 to 10. I told her the scale didn't go high enough. They gave me a clipboard, 2 pamphlets, and a recommendation for group therapy. I went to one meeting. Everyone there looked like they'd been waiting to speak for 10 years and forgot how. One guy just stared at the wall the whole time. Another kept checking his watch like he was timing something. I never went back. Not because I didn't care. Because I didn't have the energy to convince anyone I was worth fixing. Instead, I bought a secondhand ThinkPad and moved into a furnished sublease that had a moldy couch and a neighbor who sang opera at 3 a.m. That's where Cypher Vanguard started. Back then, it wasn't a name. It was just me, an idea, and a guy I served with Mason Ford who used to debug NSA comm systems on his lunch breaks. Mason was the kind of guy who could find holes in your firewall faster than you could find your own mouse. He was also the only person I trusted enough to share anything with. We built our first prototype in his garage, a predictive engine that flagged suspicious activity in secure comm networks before it became breach level. Government systems were notoriously bad at this. Mason called our code better than the crap Homeland's still using from 2007. We submitted a white paper to the Defense Innovation Unit. I thought it would land in a digital trash bin. 2 weeks later, we got an email. Come pitch this in person. We showed up in boots and button-downs, got laughed at by 2 majors and an IT analyst with an attitude problem. Then, we ran our demo live. It caught a known bad actor mid-transmission. The room got quiet fast. They gave us a 1-year test contract. Low 6 figures, enough to quit side gigs and go full-time. I dropped everything else. Mason did too. Within a year, we caught our first major leak. An internal contractor siphoning encrypted intel to a non-US domain. Quiet case, never hit the press. But we got a phone call from someone in the Pentagon whose name I'm not allowed to say out loud. They asked us to build something bigger. So we did. We expanded our system. Added anomaly detection, real-time packet inspection, and internal risk modeling. I stopped sleeping more than 4 hours a night. Not because of PTSD anymore, but because I was addicted to building something that mattered. Funding followed. First from a low-profile defense incubator, then from a classified contract tied to an anti-infiltration task force. We weren't sexy like Palantir. We didn't need to be. We were accurate, silent, and boring. Just how they like it. By the 3rd year, Cypher Vanguard was running threat modeling for multiple defense clients, flagging over 40% of malicious outbound activity before anyone else caught it. We didn't make headlines. That was the point. I never put my name on anything public. I didn't need credit. I needed control, and I wanted it done right. People assumed I'd vanished post-military, that I was lying low, maybe teaching self-defense classes or whatever cliché they pictured for broken vets. Let them think that. It kept me off the radar. Once, a cousin posted on Facebook that it was so sad how I'd wasted my education and never reintegrated properly. I laughed. From the seat of my company's small but secure headquarters in Northern Virginia, where our firewalls were tighter than their trust funds. Mason and I never did a press tour. We never sought praise. Our clients didn't send flowers. But every time we closed a breach, someone didn't lose a job. Someone didn't go to prison. Someone didn't die. That was enough. Back at the table, someone said something about crypto investments and AI-generated portfolios. I snorted under my breath. Our algorithms had quietly rewritten half of their favorite fintech backends. But sure, keep telling yourselves you understand innovation. I took a sip of water, letting the glass cover my smirk. Aunt Jean leaned over the table with her wine glass raised like she was about to toast someone. Can we take a second to appreciate how well everyone's doing this year? That was the cue. One by one, she rattled off names like an MC at a charity gala. Bradley made partner. Elise bought a house in Charlotte. Logan's daughter got into Yale. Pre-med, of course. All smiles. Applause. Forks tapping plates. No one mentioned me. Not even accidentally. Which was fine. I'd gotten used to being the one they didn't talk about. I was practically a ghost at these things, just solid enough to carve a seat at the table, invisible enough to pretend I was background furniture. Mom sat 2 seats down, arms folded, expression neutral like always. If I ever got hit by a bus, she'd probably email the obituary to the family with no subject line. Across the table, Darren was showing his new Rolex to Uncle Rick, twisting his wrist like a game show model. Limited edition, he said. Custom bezel. Not the crap you get in department stores. Looks nice, Rick nodded, sipping from a glass of some wine he couldn't pronounce, but kept bragging about. You into watches, Nora? Darren turned toward me. I used to be, I said, keeping my tone flat. He raised an eyebrow. Used to. Time became kind of abstract after Syria. That shut him up for a second. Just long enough for Elise, the real estate niece, to chime in. I've always wondered, what exactly do you do now? Like, day to day? Before I could answer, someone else spoke up. She works in, what was it, internet safety? Like IT? Close enough. Cybersecurity, I said. Elise blinked. So like antivirus software? No, I said. More like federal threat detection systems. Blank stares. Then polite nods. Then another pivot to Bradley's big case last quarter. I wasn't offended. I just watched. Like always. This was the role I played at every gathering. The background veteran. The obligatory thank you for your service anecdote no one really wanted to hear. The person who got asked if I was still doing that army thing 2 years after I left. It was the same every time. They'd talk over me, ask surface-level questions, then move on the second it required actual listening. The funniest part? These were the same people who'd post military tributes every Memorial Day. Flags, hashtags, photo filters. But when the actual soldier sat across from them, all they saw was someone who hadn't adjusted. Aunt Jean leaned in again, lowering her voice like she was doing me a favor. Sweetheart, I know it's been tough. Transitions are hard. Have you looked into any career coaches? I run a company, I said, deadpan. Oh, really? Like a small business? Something like that. Mom reached for the wine. She's always been evasive about that stuff. Never likes to share. That one stung only because it was true and not for the reason she thought. I didn't share because every time I tried, I watched the light leave their eyes before I hit sentence 2. They didn't want to hear about cyber warfare, national security, or data protection. They wanted LinkedIn titles, dollar signs, and Instagrammable achievements. They wanted digestible success. Mine wasn't teaser. Suddenly, the youngest niece Sophie looked up from her phone. She was maybe 13, glued to her screen the entire night. Hey, didn't someone from your company help stop that thing with the government leak last month? The one all over TikTok? The table went quiet. Very quiet. Mom narrowed her eyes. What is she talking about? I looked at Sophie. Smart kid. I shrugged. Some stuff got flagged early, that's all. Darren leaned in. Wait, flagged by who? Does it matter? I said, still calm. Bradley sat back, trying to piece things together like it was a courtroom deposition. You're saying your company works with the government directly? I didn't say anything. Jesus, Elise muttered, half laughing. All this time we thought you were living in a basement. I smiled. I do have a basement. It's under a secure server room. Mom put down her fork a little harder than necessary. You could have told us. Would it have made a difference? She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Aunt Jean and changed the subject back to how Logan's daughter might get early acceptance into med school. I took a sip of water and kept my face neutral. I'd learned to read battlefields after all. This one wasn't different, just better dressed. I reached for the cranberry sauce just to keep my hands moving. It was that or start breaking wine glasses. The silence that followed Sophie's comment hadn't lasted long, but the shift in tone was sharp enough to slice drywall. Mom was swirling her wine like it held answers. She never drank much, but when she did, it was always red, always dry, and always during moments when she needed to feel like the adult in the room. She set the glass down and looked at me with that faux curious tone that's really just verbal fencing. Nora, she said, you've clearly been busy, but I think what we all wonder is if things are going so well, why keep it all a secret? Here we go. Aunt Jean leaned in like she was watching an episode of Dateline. Darren smirked. Bradley folded his arms. I dabbed my mouth with a napkin and looked straight at her. Because it's mine. Everything you have is because this country gave you benefits, Mom replied, voice sharp now. You act like you built it alone. The country didn't give me anything. I earned it. With deployments, clearances, and nights I still can't sleep through. You don't have to get defensive, she said. I'm not, I said. But let's not pretend this is about curiosity. You never asked because you didn't want to know. She bristled. You're being dramatic. That's when she did it. The line. You were never the smart one, Nora. You were. Determined, I'll give you that. But not exceptional. The table went dead quiet. Forks froze midair. Someone dropped a roll. Even the niece with the TikTok addiction looked up like she couldn't believe what she'd just heard. I stared at her. Not in shock, not in rage, just stillness. The kind of stillness you learn when a drone passes overhead and you don't know if it's friendly. Dad shifted in his seat. Margaret. But she wasn't done. I'm just saying, she continued, adjusting her napkin like this was a book club. You're very good at following orders, I'm sure. But this idea that you've built some empire in secret, it sounds a little exaggerated. That word, exaggerated. As if I'd spent my adult life LARPing in camouflage for a participation ribbon. Bradley coughed lightly, trying to save the room. Maybe she's just being modest. A lot of veterans go into contracting after service. Yeah, Darren chimed in. Doesn't mean she's the next Elon Musk. I don't want to be Elon Musk, I said calmly. I just don't need this family's validation. Aunt Jean jumped in like a PR manager. Let's not get heated. It's the holidays. But it was too late. Mom had drawn the blood. And now everyone was just pretending not to see the wound. Dad cleared his throat. Nora, you've always taken a different path. We may not have understood it, but don't, I said, cutting him off without looking at him. Because if he tried to soften the blow, it would only confirm how deep it landed. I stared at my plate. The turkey bones looked like evidence, like something forensic scientists would study in a lab later. What does it take for a parent to say that? Not even out of rage, but with the composure of someone reading from a teleprompter. I wasn't hurt. Not in the obvious way. But there's a specific kind of cold that runs through your spine when someone finally says the thing they've been thinking for years. Not exceptional. I'd briefed 4-star generals, Saturday across from NSA brass. Been asked to testify off the record about vulnerabilities that could shut down entire communications grids. But to her, I was still the one who didn't choose law school. Who didn't wear heels or post graduation photos or marry some boring financial analyst. The room fumbled to recover. Darren started a new conversation about crypto volatility. Elise asked for more green beans. Sophie went back to her phone. I stayed silent. Because what do you say when your own mother declares you average in a room full of people who never even saw your starting line? I could have stood up, thrown something, walked out, but I didn't. I just reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a napkin. I used it to wipe my mouth. The corner of the metal brushed against my fingers as I did. I didn't bring it to show off. But suddenly, I wasn't sure I needed to hide it anymore either. My fingers stayed on the metal a second too long. Not grabbing it, just feeling it. The cold edge of the Distinguished Service Cross pressing against the inside of my jacket like it knew it was time. Then I reached for my water again, pulling my hand out casually, and that's when it happened. The lining of the jacket caught. The metal slipped out. Not all the way. Just enough for the silver and ribbon to flash against the overhead light and land square in Dad's line of sight. He froze. Completely. Like someone had hit pause on his entire nervous system. His fork dropped, clattering against the porcelain with a sound sharp enough to break every conversation in the room. "What's that?" he said, his voice low, but already trembling. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He knew. He leaned forward as if gravity had suddenly shifted. Mom turned to him, confused. "What's what?" "That," Dad whispered, pointing slowly. "That metal, where did you get that?" Everyone followed his finger. It wasn't dramatic. No music swell. Just eyes narrowing, mouths slightly open, breaths collectively held. No, that's not possible," he muttered. Bradley squinted. "Wait, is that?" Kevin, the cousin who couldn't finish a sentence without name-dropping Goldman Sachs, chimed in like he'd just been handed a Jeopardy buzzer. "That's a Distinguished Service Cross." The room blinked. Kevin looked at me, then the medal, then back. "That's second highest U.S. military award. You don't just get that. I mean, you get it," Dad interrupted, voice hollow, "when you risk everything." Mom blinked at me, eyes scanning like she was trying to find something familiar in my face. "Is that real?" I took a breath. "Yeah. But how?" she asked. "You were just—" "I was there," I said. "In Syria. 2017. One extraction team short. A group of soldiers pinned down near Deir ez-Zor. We didn't have air cover. Comms were down. I went in anyway." Silence. "You led it?" Dad asked. I coordinated the evac, ran point. Got 17 out. Lost 2. He sat back like he'd been hit in the chest. "No one told us," Mom said, her voice softer now, almost uncertain. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because what would have changed?" I asked. "Would you have suddenly believed I wasn't a disappointment?" That made her flinch. Just slightly. Bradley was still staring. "That medal. It's worth more than everything on this table combined." "All right. Elise's jaw tightened, like realizing the most important person at this table wasn't even in her family group chat. "You've had that this whole time?" Darren asked. "Yeah," I said. "Didn't think it matched the centerpiece." Dad leaned forward again, elbows on the table like he needed to anchor himself. "I used to show you pictures of that medal when you were a kid," he said. "Told you about Captain Ames. Said it was the kind of award that didn't get handed out lightly." I nodded. "You said it was earned in moments that defined a person." He blinked fast. "I kept the picture," I said, "in my locker. Deployment after deployment. Not for the glory, for the reminder." No one spoke. Even Sophie, the teenager, had stopped scrolling and was now just staring with wide eyes. "You never told us," Mom repeated. "You told me who I was before I ever had a chance to show you," I replied. Dad looked like he wanted to say something else, but instead, he just reached for his napkin. He wiped his mouth slowly, as if trying to collect pieces of himself before they fell apart at the table. "I remember reading about that mission," Kevin said suddenly. "Anonymous female officer, no name released. You were—" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Recognition had already landed like a gut punch across the table. "That article was yours?" Dad whispered. "The intel leak scared the Pentagon," I said, keeping my voice even. "They classified the mission. Name scrubbed. I didn't argue." Aunt Jean set down her wine glass. "Well," she said, adjusting her tone like she'd just realized she'd been cheering for the wrong team. "Isn't that something?" That was her version of an apology. Darren cleared his throat, now visibly uncomfortable. Bradley looked at me like I was a stranger. "Good." That medal had sat in a drawer for almost 5 years. Not out of shame, but because some things don't need a stage. Until someone hands you a microphone disguised as insult. I didn't tuck the medal back into my jacket. I let it sit on the edge of my lap, cold and quiet. Let them look. Let them try to make sense of it. Because finally they had to see me without their filters. The sound of the air vent above us was the only thing filling the space now. Every conversation had collapsed into silence, like the room itself was recalibrating around the fact that the family's most invisible member had just dropped a live grenade on their perception of her. Mom hadn't moved. She kept her eyes on the medal, like staring long enough might rewrite history. Then her brow furrowed, something clicked, not in confusion recognition. Her hand drifted toward her wine glass, but stopped halfway. She looked at me like she was trying to put together a puzzle she didn't realize she'd created herself. "You said Syria," she said slowly. I nodded. "Dear as Zor, 2017. You said you pulled 17 out." "Yeah." She looked down at the table. "I covered that up." Every head turned. "I wrote about it for the journal," she said, now mostly to herself. "Classified mission, no names released. The story got buried under the budget bill. But I remember it. Command said the officer risked an air corridor breach. Went off plan. Saved the whole squad. The internal chatter was calling her the ghost commander." Dad sat back, stunned. "That was you," she whispered. "That was you, wasn't it?" "I don't know," I said. "That's what they called her?" She nodded. I took a bite of cold mashed potatoes like I hadn't just detonated her professional reality. Mom blinked like someone had just unplugged her brain and restarted it. I quoted a colonel," she said, barely audible now. "He said it was the most surgical field decision he'd seen in years. I framed that quote for my office wall." "You hung my mission on your wall," I said, finally looking at her, "and still thought I was just drifting through life?" "I didn't know," she said, shaking her head. "They wouldn't give us a name." "They didn't," I replied. "But you never once thought it could be me?" "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I cut in. "You thought that kind of courage belonged to someone else. Someone male. Someone exceptional. Not your daughter. Not the one who chose a uniform over a lecture hall." Silence again. This time, heavier. Dad stared at her like he'd just discovered a stranger at the table. "You wrote about her," he said, stunned. "You literally wrote about your own daughter without even knowing." End quote. Mom didn't answer. Because she couldn't. Because for all her reporting, all her journalism, all her stories about truth and uncovering injustice, the one truth that stared her in the face for years had never been worth investigating. "You remember the quote, right?" I asked. The colonel said, "She didn't follow orders. She followed the mission. That's the line you used." Her eyes welled up. I remember. I was 28, I said. My team didn't even have air cover. We had a half-burned convoy, one broken SATCOM, and a window of 12 minutes. I made the call. Mom covered her mouth with her hand. Aunt Jean whispered, "You were that officer?" "Yeah," I said. "But don't worry. Mom got paid to tell the story." The jab landed. Not cruel, but surgical. Like the field decision she'd once admired without knowing it belonged to me. Dad looked between us. "You always said that story haunted you." "It did," she whispered. I couldn't stop thinking about her. "She was in your kitchen," I said. "Every Thanksgiving. You just never looked." Kevin let out a short, awkward laugh. "Jesus Christ." "Language?" Aunt Jean said automatically. "Mom," Sophie said, breaking her silence. "Why didn't you ever ask her what she did?" There it was. The question. Simply. Honest. Indicting. Mom couldn't answer. Not directly. She stared at the napkin on her lap like it might fold itself into a reason. "I think," I said, because she didn't want to risk hearing something that didn't fit her narrative. "That's not fair," Mom muttered. "It's accurate." Dad cleared his throat. "You always talked about how important that piece was. Said it made you believe journalism still mattered." "It did," she said. "But it was Nora's story," he said. "Not yours." For a second, no one knew what to say. Bradley looked like he wanted to disappear into the stuffing tray. Elise stirred her sweet potatoes with a knife. Darren suddenly had nothing to flex. And for once, no one made a joke to diffuse it. The table sat in the weight of its own ignorance. All that noise, all those years, and they'd never once thought to ask me what I'd seen, what I'd done, who I really was. Until now. The article Mom had framed, the quote she had loved, the soldier she'd written about. It was me. Not a symbol. Not a soundbite. Not a tragic footnote in a Thanksgiving dinner they'd forgotten to include. Me. The woman at the table. The daughter she thought she understood. Sophie leaned over toward Elise and whispered something, eyes wide. Elise didn't respond. She was too busy pretending her fork was interesting. Across the table, Kevin squinted at me like he was scanning for a punchline. "Wait, you're telling us you were the field officer behind that op, and now you run a cybersecurity company working with defense?" I didn't say yes. I didn't say anything at all. Instead, I pulled out my phone, unlocked it, and opened the executive dashboard app Mason and I used internally. The newest contract sat at the top of the list, Cypher Vanguard, secured vendor for DoD's Zero Trust Initiative. I rotated the phone and slid it across the table toward him. He looked, blinked, scanned again. Elise leaned over to see it too. Her eyes narrowed. Uncle Rick peered like he was trying to read a foreign language. Dad picked up his wine glass and forgot to drink. Kevin's voice cracked. "Is this real?" "The Pentagon doesn't really hand out fake contracts," I said. "That one's for $240 million over 5 years. Bradley made a sound like a cough, and a gasp had a baby. Mom looked like someone had unplugged her spinal cord. I kept going. "We're building a multi-layered threat detection mesh for critical comms infrastructure, end-to-end encryption with machine learning adversarial testing. Our system just passed red cell evaluations at Fort Meade." Elise blinked rapidly. "Wait, so you're the CEO?" "Co-founder, and I handle executive operations. Mason leads the tech side." Kevin still had the phone in his hands. "This valuation, this is private," I cut in. "So I'd appreciate it not being texted to anyone's brokerage group chat." He placed the phone back down like it might explode. Uncle Rick finally found his voice. "How come we've never heard of any of this?" I raised an eyebrow. "Because you were too busy talking about Darren's NFT portfolio." Darren looked deeply offended, like I'd just kicked his golden retriever. Bradley shifted gears. "You've had military clearance this whole time? Like top secret?" I nodded once. "And none of us knew?" "That's the point," I said. "You're not supposed to." Mom opened her mouth, then closed it again. She looked at the screen, looked at me, then back. "This is what you've been building all these years," she said quietly. "It is." Dad finally asked. "So, what exactly does Cypher Vanguard do?" In regular words? I leaned back. We find the things no one else can. The signals in the noise. The threats that haven't surfaced yet. Hours full. He stared at me like he wasn't sure if he was proud or scared. Maybe both. Kevin was still processing. This quantum trade acquisition, was that you too? I gave a slow nod. That's the merger closing next month. We'll take over their entire Eastern Threat Division. Our system will handle 30% of AI-monitored financial surveillance in Asia. Uncle Rick choked on his wine. Aunt Jean reached for her pearls like they might shield her from how fast the room was shifting. Elise asked the obvious. Then why? Why keep it quiet? You could have dropped this years ago. Shut us all up. I smiled, calm. Because I wasn't building it for you. Darren mumbled. I thought you were broke. I thought you were good at crypto. I shot back. That shut him up. Bradley leaned forward, searching. And now? What's next? Well, I said, next month's contract with NATO. Then a NATO JSOC integration for joint threat modeling. And a small pilot with Space Force, but that one's still classified. Mom sat there, silent, like her ears were ringing. Kevin exhaled like a man who just found out the quiet kid from math class invented the next Google. I leaned in slightly. That watch you all mocked earlier? That wasn't a flex. It was a gift. Something I bought for someone who taught me to care about precision. Dad looked down at his empty wrist. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. Mom finally whispered, You're really not exaggerating. No, I said. I've never needed to. The room tried to reset itself like a system crash where everyone was scrambling for new input. But there was nothing left to say. I had built a fortress in silence, and now they were staring at the walls of it for the first time. They weren't inside. They were guests, and I didn't owe them a tour. Dad was still staring at the empty spot on his wrist, like he'd just realized something had been missing for years. Meanwhile, across the table, the usual chatter had vanished. No one was trading stories about bonuses or properties or country clubs anymore. The silence wasn't tense. It was hollow, the kind that only sets in when people realize the status ladder they've been climbing might be leaning against the wrong building. Aunt Jean reached for the wine again, but this time without a quip. Her signature move, a sigh, and a humble brag never arrived. Bradley tried to say something twice and gave up. Even his cufflinks looked embarrassed. Darren tapped his Rolex against the side of his water glass, maybe hoping someone would still notice. No one did. Kevin cleared his throat. So, your company, is it public? It's private, I said. We've had acquisition offers, but we're holding. Defense tech isn't something you sell to the highest bidder. That shut him up fast. Uncle Rick perked up, voice a bit too enthusiastic. Well, if you're ever looking for investors, I'd love to diversify a little. Just a toe in the water. We're fully funded, I said simply. Last round was oversubscribed by $3 billion. That number dropped like a stone into the center of the table. Mom blinked hard. 3 billion? I nodded. Series E. We closed it last quarter. Mostly institutional capital. BlackRock, Carlyle, some sovereign wealth groups. Darren muttered. That's more than all of us combined. Yeah, I said. I figured. Aunt Jean tried to pivot. Well, isn't it wonderful how the military gave you the discipline to start something like that? I tilted my head. It wasn't discipline. It was grief and guilt and a refusal to let what I saw over there get buried under layers of bureaucracy. Elise looked away. Kevin took a sip of water like it might help him swallow the new reality. Mom still hadn't said much, but her fingers were gripping her napkin so tightly it looked like she might tear through the cloth. Dad finally spoke. You built all this, from scratch. Yes, I said. No loans? Number. No favors? Number. He nodded slowly. And all those years? You never said a word. I was busy, I said, building something real. Bradley shifted in his chair. I always thought you were just, trying to figure things out. I was, I said. Just not in the way you assumed. Ungreat. Sophie, who'd been unusually quiet, spoke up again. I told you guys. She's cool. That got a soft chuckle from a few people. But it didn't break the tension. It just highlighted who had adapted and who hadn't. Mom finally straightened her posture and looked around the table. Well, Now that we all know Nora's company is quite successful, that quite was doing a lot of work. I think it's only fair to say, she continued, we're all proud of what you've accomplished. End of tree. I raised an eyebrow. Pride doesn't usually come after mockery. She blinked. That's not what it is, I said. You didn't just doubt me. You actively dismissed me. And now that it's quantifiable, now that it comes with dollar signs and contracts and headlines, suddenly I matter. No one had a comeback. Aunt Jean looked deeply fascinated by her mashed potatoes. Darren attempted a smile. Hey Nora, if you ever want to speak at my firm, I think the guys would love to hear your story. Women in leadership is kind of a trend right now. Not a trend, I said. Just late recognition. He nodded quickly, like he was agreeing with a boss. Kevin tried next. You know, we have a tech team at Goldman looking into threat detection software. Maybe there's some synergy. Your team's already a client, I interrupted. They onboarded last quarter. His jaw slackened. Dad laughed once. Not out loud. Just a short puff of air through his nose. The kind of laugh you make when you finally realize you've spent 10 years giving advice to the wrong child. The table stayed quiet, not because anyone had nothing to say, but because for once no one knew how to sound important anymore. Dad kept looking between me and the metal, still resting near the corner of my plate. It sat there like a loaded weapon, quiet, powerful, and completely undeniable. Then I reached into my bag and pulled out a small velvet box. Not dramatic. No grand gesture. Just a slow, deliberate motion. I opened it in front of me and held it out across the table. Mom blinked. What's that? It's for you, I said. She hesitated, then reached for it carefully, like she wasn't sure if it would bite. Inside was a replica of the Distinguished Service Cross. Not a knockoff, not a plastic novelty from eBay. A regulation-engraved ceremonial duplicate, commissioned through proper channels. She stared at it. This isn't, she started. It's not the one I was awarded, I said. That one stays in my safe. This one's yours. Thought you might want a souvenir from the story you once wrote. She didn't answer, but her hands were trembling. Kevin muttered, Damn. Dad leaned closer. You're giving that to her. I'm giving her something she can hang next to the quote on her wall, I said. Might as well match the reality this time. Aunt Jean's mouth opened, then shut again. Uncle Rick took off his glasses to clean them, just for something to do. You don't have to, Mom said, finally finding her voice. I know, I said, but some things aren't about winning. They're about reminding people that value doesn't always come dressed like you expected. Her throat tightened. She nodded, once, and closed the box like it might fall apart in her hands. Bradley, who'd remained impressively silent the last 20 minutes, asked, Why keep this all from us? Seriously. If I'd done all that, I'd have my resume painted on the side of a building. Because then it becomes about the resume, I said, not the work. He scratched his jaw. Yeah, I guess. Darren looked confused. So you didn't want anyone to know? I didn't need anyone to know, I replied. I needed to know it was real, that it meant something beyond headlines or handshakes or LinkedIn bragging. Sophie gave me a small thumbs up from her end of the table. I didn't return it, but I didn't ignore it either. Mom spoke again, softer this time. You could have left, Nora. Years ago. After everything, you could have cut us off completely. I thought about it, I admitted. More than once. That landed hard. Even Elise, who had spent half the meal inspecting the thread count on her napkin, looked up now. But I didn't, I continued. Because despite all the nonsense, despite the condescension and dismissals, this is still my family. For better or worse. Dad cleared his throat again. I never wanted to push you away. I just wanted you safe. I was never safe, I said. Not really, not over there, not here. But I chose what I chose. And I survived it. And I built something no one can take from me. There was a pause. Not uncomfortable. Just reflective. Then Mom surprised me. She said, It's beautiful. I looked at her. She was staring at the replica metal in her hands. The weight of it. The detail. Oh, it's more than metal, I said. It's blood, dust, and memory. It's sacrifice. Her hands folded gently over the box, like she was afraid she might drop it. She didn't look at me again, but I saw her jaw clench just slightly. Not in anger. In regret. I'm sorry, she said. 2 words. No drama. No excuses. Just that. I nodded. That was enough. Uncle Rick shifted. Well, if anyone needs help understanding defense appropriations, We're good, I said flatly. Already have 3 former DoD undersecretaries advising. Oh, well, of course, he mumbled, sitting back. For the first time all evening, it didn't feel like a battlefield. Not a victory lap, not a family reunion, just a brief moment of stillness. Not everything needed to be corrected. Some truths just needed to be heard. Some medals aren't earned for glory. They're earned so someone else at the table can finally stop pretending they know who you are. Dad's hand rested lightly on the velvet box, his thumb brushing the corner of the medal like he was reacquainting himself with something sacred. His gaze wasn't fixed on anyone. He just sat there, eyes a little glassy, a little lost, like his internal compass had finally spun back toward true north. No one was talking anymore, not really. The plates were still half full. Someone had poured more wine, but didn't say for who. Dishes were passed down the table in near silence, as if no one wanted to interrupt the weight of what had just shifted between us. Mom didn't speak again, but I noticed she set the metal box down gently beside her plate, not away from her, not hidden, just placed, like a quiet reminder. She didn't touch her phone the rest of the evening. Kevin looked like he was trying to calculate something in his head, maybe how long it would take him to pivot his career into AI cybersecurity, or whether he could ask for an internal referral without sounding desperate. I let him stew. Darren had gone full mute. Even his hair looked less smug. Sophie gave me a sideways glance. A real one this time. Not admiration, not curiosity, just connection. I didn't nod back. I didn't have to. Bradley was chewing so slowly he may have forgotten he had food in his mouth. And Dad? He finally looked at me and said, I used to think collecting watches was about precision, engineering, beauty. I waited. He gave the faintest smile. But I think I just like knowing someone out there could make something that perfect. Then you already understood, I said. Even back then. His eyes lingered on the metal. I don't know how I missed it. Bye. You weren't supposed to see it, I replied. Not until you looked past everything else. He nodded slowly. The silence didn't feel awkward anymore. It felt earned. The family dynamic hadn't magically healed. No one was about to hold hands and sing, but the hierarchy, the quiet little pecking order that had ruled this table for years, was cracked. I didn't need to shatter it. All I had to do was show them I'd never been trying to sit on it in the first place. At some point, Aunt Jean offered me a piece of pie. Not a sarcastic offering, not a guilt slice, just pie. I took it. Small gestures, subtle recalibrations. You can feel the room change without anyone saying so. Even the volume had shifted. No more raised voices, no passive-aggressive digs, just clinks of forks against ceramic and the occasional throat clear. Dad leaned over once more and said, quietly, I saw a watch like yours at an auction in Geneva. 20 years ago. I didn't even bid. Knew I couldn't touch it. Yeah, I said, but that was the one that started it all, right? He nodded. It wasn't about owning it, he said. It was about chasing something perfect. You passed that on, I said. Whether you meant to or not. He looked like he might tear up again, but didn't. Instead, he adjusted his posture and did something simple. Something no one at that table could have expected. He raised his water glass. To Nora, he said. No toast, no speech, just that. And they followed. Mom, Sophie, even Darren, one by one, like a quiet surrender. Not to me, but to the version of me they never saw coming. I didn't raise my glass in return. I didn't need to. Instead, I just looked around the table and said, thanks. But don't toast me. Toast the people who didn't make it home. They're the reason I ever got the chance to build anything at all. That brought a pause. Not dramatic, just respectful. Even Kevin didn't try to follow it with a story about his firm. That was enough. No speeches, no redemption arcs, just presence. And for once, that was all I needed from them. As the last dishes were cleared and someone finally turned off the playlist of jazzy holiday covers, I pushed back my chair and stood up. No announcement, no big gesture, just movement. I slipped on my coat, the same simple one I always wore, and adjusted the collar. The metal was already packed away again. like it had never been there at all. Elise was showing Aunt Jean some photos on her phone, something about a new beach house, probably damage control. Darren was still refreshing his emails, hoping for some digital lifeline to his dignity. Kevin avoided eye contact altogether. I didn't bother saying goodbye to everyone. That would have felt forced. But as I passed Dad, he looked up at me, then nodded slowly. "Proud of you," he said. Not loud, not performative. Just enough. I nodded back. Mom reached out as I passed her and lightly touched my arm. "That medal, the real one, do you ever wear it?" "No," I said, "it's not for show." She let her hand fall. "Still, you should know it suits you." I didn't respond, just offered a faint smile and kept walking. Outside, the air hit colder than I expected. Not sharp, just brisk. I exhaled and could see the cloud of my breath drift into the night. The parking lot shimmered with reflections from 100 taillights. Families were still leaving the other dining rooms, bundled up and chatting about dessert or leftovers or football games. Normal, comfortable, unaware. I made my way to the edge of the lot where the bus stop sat, half hidden behind a hedge and a metal trash can. A familiar figure stepped out from the shadows. Mason. He handed me a takeaway coffee without saying a word. Black, just the way I liked it. "You good?" he finally asked. "Yeah," I said. "Better than expected." "That bad, huh?" I smirked. "Actually, no, they shut up." He let out a low whistle. "Damn, that is progress." We sat on the bench together, steam rising from our cups. The last of the relatives filtered past in their BMWs and Audis, each one pretending not to look in my direction. "They know who you are now?" Mason asked. I shook my head. "Not really, but they know who I'm not." "That's almost better." End. We sipped in silence for a while. Then I pulled out my phone. No Instagram, no email. Just a single app, the one we use to monitor our systems in real time. Activity was quiet. Tokyo servers green. Brussels node running hot but stable. I showed Mason the screen. "We're gonna need to scale capacity before Monday. Traffic's up 11% week over week." He leaned in. "Want me to reroute load to Oslo until the Singapore node comes online?" "Already queued it," I said. He grinned. "You know, I keep forgetting you used to break code under mortar fire." "Yeah," I said. "Turns out you don't need silence to focus. Just training." The bus pulled in, its brakes hissing like a long sigh. We didn't board yet, just sat, letting the heat from the exhaust wash over our boots. "I told Dad about Geneva," I said. Mason raised an eyebrow. "The watch?" I nodded. "He know it was you who drove the bid price up?" "Yeah." "What'd he say?" "Nothing. But he didn't have to." Hem. The moment replayed in my head his stunned silence, the way he touched the case, like it was holy. I gave him the second one. I added. Mason didn't ask why. He already knew. "You could have told them everything years ago," he said. "I know. But you didn't." "Some things aren't meant to be explained," I said. "Only seen when people are finally ready to look." The door of the bus creaked open. I stood, stepped up onto the platform, and dropped my fare in the machine. Mason followed, taking the seat beside me near the back. As we pulled away from the restaurant, I glanced out the window. Inside, I could see Dad holding the velvet box. Not flashing it, not passing it around, just holding it like a relic of something he'd lost and maybe just regained. Mom sat beside him, quiet, her phone forgotten for once. Her gaze was soft, far away, not calculating for once. The bus turned the corner. The restaurant faded behind us. And I leaned back, letting the hum of the engine replace every conversation that never needed to happen. When I got back to my apartment, the lights were already on. Automatic timers, one of those little details you pick up from years of being in unsecured zones. You don't come home to a dark space, ever. I set my keys down, kicked off my boots, and walked straight past the open laptop still displaying market feeds from London. I wasn't in the mood. I poured a glass of water. Not wine. Not whiskey. Just cold tap water. Clean, honest, American. Then I went to the wall. Not the white one near the television. The brick one near the corner, raw, uneven, weathered. The one I'd left untouched since moving in. It reminded me of old base housing. Syria, Ramadi, Kabul. Even the air near that wall always felt different. There were only two things already hanging there: a framed photo of my unit, taken a week before everything went sideways, and an old cloth patch faded and frayed from a tactical vest that didn't survive. I pulled out the medal, the real one this time. Distinguished Service Cross, second only to the Medal of Honor, the thing no one at that dinner even knew existed before tonight, except Dad. I held it for a second, letting the weight settle in my hand. It wasn't heavy because of the medal. It was heavy because of what it cost. Safe and sane soldiers. Some broken, some whole, all alive. And the three who didn't make it, who I couldn't reach in time, whose names weren't printed in family newsletters or Facebook posts, just remembered quietly by people like me. I mounted the medal next to the photo and the patch, not in the center, not surrounded by flags or lights, just placed it there, honest, plain. The wall didn't need to be curated. It needed to be real. I stepped back and looked at it. Not for admiration, for grounding. This is what mattered. Not the valuation. Not the Pentagon contract. Not Kevin's face when I dropped the word merger. Not the hush at the table when they realized I wasn't a failure who took the bus. I was the one funding the algorithms behind half their brokerage moves. None of that mattered like this did. I sat on the edge of the couch, facing the wall, sipping water, letting the silence fill the room. Not a hollow silence like in the restaurant. Not a defensive one like back in my old bedroom after another lecture. This silence was whole, like exhaling after holding your breath for years. My phone buzzed once. A message from Mason. London nodes back under 60% load. Brussels rerouted. All green. I replied, "Good. Let it ride." Then I set the phone face down and left it there. No status updates. No victory post. No cryptic quote captioned with a photo of the medal. The story didn't need to be told online. Some revenge doesn't involve burning anything down. Sometimes it looks like sitting in your apartment alone with a glass of water, knowing that the people who once dismissed you now struggle to look you in the eye not because you hurt them, but because you didn't need to. I could have humiliated them. I had enough data, contracts, leverage, and headlines to flip the whole family tree upside down. But that would have made me like them. Instead, I handed my mother a medal and gave my father back the watch of his dreams. I gave them truth. Not to rub in their faces, but to remind them I was never the problem. I was the product of a war they never had to understand, a mission they never believed in, and a success they never saw coming because it didn't arrive dressed like a banker or a hedge fund analyst. It came in combat boots, quiet trauma, and a startup nobody talked about until it changed the game. I turned off the lights, left only the desk lamp on, casting a glow on the brick wall. One medal, one patch, one photo. That's all it took to feel whole. The elevator down the hall dinged, someone laughing in the distance, life continuing, markets spinning, algorithms running. But for now, I leaned back on the couch, stared at the brick, and let myself feel, not proud, not even peaceful, just real. And that was enough. I didn't build an empire to prove them wrong. I built it because I knew what it felt like to be left behind, underestimated, written off. And I knew I never wanted to be the kind of person who measured others by titles, clothes, or the car they drove. The best kind of revenge isn't loud. It's showing up in a room full of people who thought they knew your worth, then letting silence do the talking. I never needed their approval. But I did need them to finally see the cost of everything they never asked about. Now they've seen it, and I'm still taking the bus by choice.